Hello, my friends. This is life coach Mike Trugman, and welcome to an episode of Mike's Search for Meaning. I'm after some big questions. Why are we here? What makes a fulfilling life? How can we grow individually and collectively? Each episode, I'll dive deep with leaders who are doing great work in the world and see how they organize their life. Books read, value systems, resources used, and stories that show how each of you can create the life and the world of your dreams. Raj, thank you so much for joining me on Mike's Search for Meaning. I know that Man's Search for Meaning is probably the book that has impacted you most, and your most recent book, Awaken, has really had a big impact on me. And right before we hit record, I said I wanted to share the part that had the biggest impact on me, because you spoke about being a cycle breaker in the book. And it resonated deeply in my body and in my soul when you described yourself as a cycle breaker, because I have called my dad that several times. He came from a lineage of very domineering, dominant, angry, unable to express themselves men. And my dad was a cycle breaker. And the impact that has had on my life, and therefore the impact that I'm now able to have as a result of his work, is profound. And I imagine that you doing this work and being the cycle breaker, just reading the book, I could see the impact that it's had on your family, on India, your country, and the global impacts that you continue to have. I just wanted to start this podcast by sincerely thanking you for doing your work and being a cycle breaker.
Well, I appreciate that. Yeah, I do think we have to step into that. Otherwise, it's a cascading effect across the generations. We become victims of victims.
Hmm.
And somebody at some point has to say the cycle stops here. I mean, there could be a virtuous or a positive cycle. We want to keep it going. But there are many of the ones that are quite harmful and causing a lot of suffering in the world.
Mm-hmm. And in your family dynamic, there are lots of patterns that you're doing work to break the cycle, and that it's not the virtuous ones. So I want to get to all of that, but I think maybe a really great place to start, which is where I start with everyone in this podcast, is the same question that I always ask: what was it like at your dinner table when you were growing up?
Yeah, if my father was home, it was very different, and he traveled quite a bit, so he wasn't always home, and I didn't know him until I was 7 anyway. But if my father was home, the dinner table was quite stiff, quite formal. You had to be on your best behavior. There was not a lot of two-way conversation. It was really our father telling us things, or not really asking us very much. So, and we felt a little bit tense, to be honest. Most of the time, I don't remember very much sort of the raucous dinners, unless, and this is a big caveat, unless it was a dinner that happened after people had a few drinks, right? And later on in life, that became common. When I went to India, our dinners were like 11 p.m. or so, after several hours of sitting and having drinks. And that's a big part of the culture that I came from, and it's something for my father that was really a necessity, in a way. He needed that alcohol to kind of soothe himself and relax himself and be able to open up and so forth. And so it was really sort of the alcohol fueled, sort of lightness at times when that happened. But when I was a child growing up, like I said, I remember it being rather tense. It was one of those households where we were all relaxed until you heard father's car or his scooter in those days in India pull into the driveway, and then everybody was like, "Oh, better make sure everything is okay, and everything is in its place, and you're clean and well behaved, and all of that." So, yeah, there was a little bit of stress and tension around it.
Mm-hmm. Could you speak a little bit about, you traveled a lot when you were younger, lived in various parts of the world, and it seems like it's been pretty formative in the way that you now have a strong global presence, and you don't look at issues just locally, but rather what's the global impact of I guess your upbringing, but also the work that you do. And so what impact would you say living in lots of different places when you were growing up had on the way that you view yourself and view the world now?
Yeah, so I was in India until the age of 7. I would say the first 5 years in a little tiny village in the middle of India, maybe 5,000 people, no electricity, of course, in those days, no running water, very, very rustic circumstances. Part of this feudal joint family with my grandfather and uncles and aunts, and lots of people living in this kind of a fortress-like house on the top of a hill. And then 2 years in the city, starting schooling in India, and that's with my mother's siblings and a caretaker. No parents were there. And then my father came back from Canada. So he had gone to get his PhD in agriculture science. So my father was unusual in that coming out of that village environment where hardly anybody, was highly educated. And most people finished schooling at fourth grade or maybe eighth grade and so forth. Very few people even completed high school. But he was very ambitious and very bright. And so he insisted on getting an education against my grandfather's objections. And finally, my grandfather allowed him to not only get a high school diploma, but then a bachelor's degree and then a master's degree. And then his professors said, you need to get a PhD. And he sent him to Canada. So he came back when I was 7, and I had no memory of him at that point because he had been gone about 5 years. And then, soon after he came back, we moved from India to Barbados. He got a job with the British West Indies Sugar Corporation, working on sugarcane research. And suddenly, you can imagine for a young child to be airlifted out of India and you're standing in London and watching the changing of the guard. And I kind of use that metaphor in the book. My mother had been my sole parent until then, and now my father had come back into my life, and it was a changing of the guard, a very different regime, if you will. And then we landed in Barbados, and we spent 2 years there. It was quite a culture shock, of course. The change was enormous, but also exciting at that age. And I was in 2 different schools there. So from the age of 7 to 9. And then my father got a job in California, in Salinas, which is the home of John Steinbeck, near San Francisco and Monterey County, about 100 miles from San Francisco. So we moved from Barbados. We actually went in between to New York and then Montreal. We spent a month in Montreal. The World's Expo was happening. Expo 67 was happening in Montreal. So we literally spent a month there living with a French family and experiencing that World's Fair. And then moved to California, where I was there from the age of 9 to 11, 2 years. And those were really tumultuous times in the world, and especially in the United States. 67 to 69, and especially in California, which was kind of the home of the anti-war movement, the hippies, all of that was happening, the psychedelic revolution that was going on, all the protests against the Vietnam War, the civil rights movement was still underway. Martin Luther King was shot while I was there, and that was a huge thing. And then a few months later, Robert Kennedy was shot, and we were watching live on TV as he won the California primary for the Democratic nomination, and would have gone on to become president in all likelihood. And so these were all momentous things. And then after 2 years there, we moved to Canada. My father had an argument with his boss at the company. There was some ethical violation that was going on, so he quit his job without having any other job. And finally, he called his professors in Manitoba, in Canada, and they offered him a professorship there. So we moved to Winnipeg in Canada in March of 69, when my brother was all of 9 days old. I had a brother who was born in California. And we took a month-long trip, to get to Winnipeg by road, exploring all the places along the way. And then spent about 9 months there. That was when the Apollo 11 landing happened. So I remember watching Neil Armstrong jumping around on the moon, and again, a huge momentous kind of episode, right, in the world. And then at the end of that year, my parents decided we were going back to India. So that was kind of my 5-year journey outside India in these different cultures, and then being taken back to India, which was a huge reverse culture shock, readjusting. At that age, you adjust very quickly to your new surroundings. And we forgot the language, and we forgot so much about, what life in India was like, that it was a huge shock in a way to go back into India, and not even to one of the big cities. We were in a smaller city. And so the kind of life that existed there at that time was radically different. There was no television, there was hardly any radio. It was a very, very poor country, still is, but compared to back then, India is a much more vibrant and rich place now. So it was very challenging having to relearn the culture and all the sort of unwritten rules of that culture and fit right back into that society, especially the culture, subculture. India is a vast country of so many diverse cultures within. We have like 500 dialects and 25 national languages and hundreds of different castes and communities, and everybody having their own unique qualities. So fitting back into my particular piece of that, which was the warrior caste, the so-called Rajputs, which come from the state of Rajasthan originally, a very, very feudal, very patriarchal, I would say, a misogynistic culture in many ways. So it was a tough adjustment back to India. And as I said, the schools, the culture, the language, all of that took a long time. But ultimately, I'm glad. I'm glad for that challenge, because had we not gone back and continued to live out in the West, I think I would have been completely disconnected from my roots.
Mm.
Unlike today, people can go back and forth easily. They can be on video chats and they can experience, and the world is much more of a globalized place. And back then, you couldn't even make a phone call. All you could do was write letters, and you couldn't afford to go back, maybe once in 5 years. So it's completely different. And there were very few Indian people in the US, so you were growing up in a completely alien culture. So I would have been completely disconnected. So despite all the challenges of readjusting, in the long run, I'm happy that we made that transition. It made me very adaptable, and I still have the ability to feel comfortable anywhere in the world because I had experienced these extremes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so thank you for all the context and background, and I'm sure it might come up at various other points of the interview, but something that seems really central, especially with the level of reflection that you've now done, something that seems central to your current work and who you are, is this integration and weaving back and forth between masculine and feminine. And what I relate to, there's many things I relate to, but one of the things I deeply relate to about the book is when you describe that you were born as a male, gentle, peaceful, innocent. That's a big word that you use a lot. And yet, being born into this warrior caste, into the Rajput culture, it was almost the exact opposite was expected of you. And so there's this tension of, I'm more like my mom. I have a deeply feminine energy, loving, caring, nurturing. And it seems to be more celebrated to be tougher, defiant, steadfast. And so I'm more like my mom, but I'm striving to be like my dad, and I want his affection, I want his approval. So how do you look at, and this is a big question, I guess, but how do you look at masculine and feminine energy, and why do you think that you're uniquely fit to be talking about it? Because it really resonates with me too.
Yeah, well, I did grow up, or I was born into an intensely masculine subculture. I would say India overall has a pretty masculine patriarchal culture, just like the United States. The United States is one of the most masculine cultures in the world, actually. But so is India, especially the patriarchal domination, right, of the father. At the same time, it also has a tradition of goddesses and goddess worship and so forth. It's an interesting paradox. The Hindu religion has tremendous reverence for the feminine, the divine feminine, right? The harshest patriarch will sit down and then worship a goddess, right? And all of the beautiful good things in life are represented by goddess figures, whether it's knowledge, whether it's prosperity, right? Whether it's equanimity, many of these things are represented in Lakshmi and Durga and Saraswati, and all of them are goddesses, right? So there's an interesting energetic thing there, that even though women may be suppressed and sidelined, they can still see themselves in the divine. And I think that's one of the differences if you look in the West. A friend of mine wrote a book called The Missing Mother God of the West, that there's not much of feminine presence in the Abrahamic traditions, right? If you look at Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, they're very much the father is the God, right? And the female, the mother is incidental, if at all present in that. So that's the sort of the underlying structure. As I said, I was born into a particularly extreme version of the masculine domination, into a culture where we literally worshipped our guns, we worshipped our swords. There's a festival. So, there's a tradition in India of people actually paying homage to the tools of their trade, their craft. So if you're a musician, you will actually put your musical instruments, and you'll have a ceremony and you will bow down to them, right? And likewise, different people have different professions. In the case of the warrior class, the tools, of our profession are the weapons, right? So the guns are worshipped, the swords are worshipped, all of that. And so that's kind of the undercurrent of it. And so I was born into that. But like I said, I had parents who were extreme opposites. As Carl Jung said, every man has an inner woman, every woman has an inner man. Most human beings are some kind of blend of masculine and feminine energy, right? My mother happened to be at the end of the spectrum where it was pure feminine energy, but hardly any masculine energy, right? So she never stood in her power, but she had this tremendous unconditional love, forgiving, and inclusive, nurturing, caring, compassionate. I mean, she never raised her voice to me in 62 years. Okay, not once, not to her other children as well, and or not to anybody else. Not even, in India, everybody middle class and above has people working for them, domestic help, right, servants. They're very badly treated in many families. But I never ever remember my mother saying a harsh word to anybody who worked for us, right? On the other hand, I had my father, who was almost an extreme representation of all masculine energy and no feminine, right? That you could see, or he hid it very well. So it was all about, command and control and domineering and so forth. And I think it's a nurture and nature, because my mother was a single mother for 7 years, essentially, the formative early years of my life. So she kind of shaped me in that way, in her own image. I'm her first child. But also, maybe that's part of my nature. I inherited that from her, and then she shaped me in that way as well. So I was very much like her. Now, of course, as in the world, but even more so then, there's a kind of shaming of the feminine, right? Anything that, nobody would ever say, oh, I'm in touch with my feminine side. That would get you laughed at, and even personally, I would feel, like, why? You're trying to be something that the world expects you to be, and especially in my case, my father wanted me to be like him. So when he came back into my life, the message I got was, you need to be the opposite. I was too trusting, I was too idealistic, I was too peace loving, harmony seeking, etc. And I was very intellectual like him. He was very, very smart, but he's also street smart, right? He wasn't just, I was not very street smart. I wasn't very savvy. I wasn't very cunning. I couldn't negotiate with people. I was just like too trusting. He said, you can't trust anybody. Too idealistic. You need to be pragmatic. You're too peace loving. You need to be rough and tough, and street smart. So I had that sense that all of my innate qualities were defects, right? And I think we do that generally with feminine qualities. We try to, suppress them in boys, especially, right? And then, of course, girls are sidelined, right? In society, generally, historically, it's getting better now, of course, but generally, in most traditional communities, the girls are educated last and the least. They're even fed last, and if there's not enough food left over, then they go without it, etc. So there's all of that undercurrent. So I think for me, it took a long time for me to first of all appreciate the qualities that I was born with, to recognize them as strengths and not as flaws, which is really what I was getting from my father. So I spent decades of my life trying to be the opposite of who I was, trying to manifest. So for example, my father bought me a gun when we went back to India. And we come from this gun-loving culture. As I told you, I had my own gun at the age of 11, I'm not even 12, an air gun. But it was a pretty powerful air gun. It could shoot all kinds of animals, from a distance. And I started to play with that and became a really good shot. And I just started to shoot and kill whatever moved, all around me. I was a terror. And somehow my father liked that, he encouraged that. But at one point, I just had a sudden awakening. I said, "Oh my God, what am I doing?" I know it happened when I shot a pigeon, and pigeon landed inside a drinking well, a well where we got our drinking water in the village. And this injured pigeon landed there and was bleeding into the water, and then died and fell into the water. And the women who were there to, use the rope and thing to get water for their families were all screaming at me. And suddenly I said, "Why am I just killing for no reason?" So I decided that day to stop killing. And when I told my father that, he got mad at me. Right? He said, "Why would you stop killing?" Like, so he was always trying to, get me to be that, kind of that heartless warrior, kind of thing, which just did not come naturally to me. So it was a struggle. I think it's a struggle for a lot of us. I heard recently from Gabor Mate. We were in Costa Rica, and Gabor Mate, the
I do.
trauma, a wonderful teacher and writer. And he said that little boys are actually more emotional and more sensitive than little girls at a young age. That's just how they are wired. But we suppress that, and in families and in society, and we tell you to be a man and don't cry, suppress your emotions, and that is deeply, deeply unhealthy for them because emotions have to move through you. You should be able to express your emotions, but if you can't, they don't disappear. They get bottled up inside you, and then they show up years or decades later as anger and violence and even disease, cancers and so forth. You can really say are traceable to suppressed emotions, right? So we don't have a very healthy relationship with gender at all. We need to respect and honor both of these, and a big part of my journey has been to recognize that, because like I said, for decades I rejected who I was and tried to be the opposite. Then I kind of swung to the other pole when I did recognize that, yeah, I am more like my mother, and I'm honoring my mother with my work, as my coach told me, and we can talk about that. And I kind
Mhm.
of became resolutely, explicitly trying to bring that energy into the world, which is needed. I think that's a worthy thing. But you can also go too far in that direction. We still need healthy masculine energy along with healthy feminine. That's the answer. The answer to the domination of masculine energy is not to swing to the other pole and only have feminine energy in the world. That's not going to work. Right? So we need that healthy combination. And I think in my case, my parents kind of gave me the extreme examples of that spectrum. My job is to figure out how to manifest both. It's not either or. You don't have to be bipolar, right? But you can integrate those polarities and say, how can you have great personal power and charisma that my father manifested in the world with unconditional love? Because my father had power and no love, my mother had love and no power. Neither of those are healthy things. Love without power is ineffective. Power without love is tyrannical.
Mhm.
If we aspire to do good in the world and make a difference, we have to figure out how to integrate those two things.
And you really summed it up beautifully at the end there, the love and power, personal power, I would say. But what would you say very quickly are the hallmark healthy qualities of masculine energy? Like if masculine energy is being held in a way that is ideal, what are the hallmark qualities of masculine energy, and what are the hallmark qualities of feminine energy? And could you also deconstruct this myth that that one pole is opposite of the other or better than the other? Because I think that one of the things I've been coming to realize in my life is that polarities actually are supportive of each other. And so healthy masculine energy actually supports healthy feminine energy, and vice versa. Like one of the insights that you have in your work is that purpose driven companies that come from the heart, if you will, are actually more profitable a lot of
Yes,
the time.
that's right.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
could you break down how they support each other and what the healthy qualities of each are?
Sure. Yeah. So if you look at the masculine, and Barry Johnson's work is really beautiful in this to help us understand polarities and how to actually then manage those polarities so that we get the best of both sides. So the healthy masculine has many gifts. The beautiful masculine, which is strength, courage, focus, resilience, determination, grit, structure, order. All of those things are the gifts of the masculine. On the other hand, you have the gifts of the feminine, compassion, empathy, caring, inclusiveness, gentleness, kindness, love. These are the gifts of the feminine. Now, if you don't have any feminine energy in the world, if you are suppressing the feminine, right? If women are sidelined and you don't respect and honor the feminine, then what happens in that world is that the healthy masculine becomes the hyper masculine energy, right? And so that becomes domination, aggression, hyper competition, excessive, a focus on winning at all costs, and everything becomes a kind of war, right? If you look at human history, we see that, right? We see human history as one conflict after another. European nations fought 1,200 wars in 600 years with each other in the centuries leading up to 1946, right? 1,200, two wars every year on average, and since then, virtually zero. So we are moving past that, but that's really the consequences of having unfettered masculine energy. And if you look at the United States, the United States was, conceived of in 1776, then born really as a country about a dozen years later, but the founding documents of this country do not make place for the feminine, right? Women were not allowed to own property and were not allowed to vote until 1920. Think about that, almost 150 years. Right? There's a famous exchange of letters between Abigail Adams and John Adams as he's in the process of writing the Constitution of this country, and she pleads with him, "Please, sir, do not forget the ladies." Right? And he kind of laughs it off, and "Madam, we fear the tyranny of the petticoat," and so forth. It's really interesting to read those things. But we sideline the feminine in the world of politics and in the economy. And so we became a hyper masculine, energy dominated. And that becomes unhealthy. When you have the absence of the other, it inevitably has to become unhealthy. So we had all the abuses in the 1800s of working conditions, of workers being treated terribly, 10% of Carnegie Steel workers dying on the job, when he raised their working hours and went from 5 days to 6 days a week and reduced their pay. And I mean, there were many examples. Hence the counter backlash of militant unions and communism and socialism and all those things arose as a response to that. So that's masculine energy run amok. And we had that in our political, we're still the only major country not to have ever had elected a woman leader. I mean, it's just it's emblematic of that, right? There was a book some years ago called America is from Mars and Europe is from Venus. Like men are from Mars, women are from Venus, that classic book. I think there's some of that exists in our national psyche. We haven't overcome that yet. On the other hand, the gifts of the feminine, as I talked about, nurturing, caring, compassion, empathy, inclusiveness, but in the absence of the healthy feminine, that becomes sentimentality, dependence, neediness, a kind of helplessness, and so forth, right? You can get immobilized if you only have that feminine energy. And so you need that combination. As Martin Luther King said, we must be tough-minded and tender-hearted, right? It's both. It's not either or, right? So we need the healthy masculine, right? And we need the healthy feminine together, and they can be present inside each of us. As Carl Jung said, every man has an inner woman, every woman has an inner man. You see it in all the knowledge systems of the world, the yin and yang in the Asian, East Asian Chinese tradition. In India we have very much that representation. There's a god figure in India called the Ardhanareshwar, the half male, half female god. Right? So one side is Shiva, and one side is Shakti. You see all the beautiful masculine qualities here, and you see all the beautiful feminine qualities here. And the message is very clear. We are born with genders for reproductive and other reasons, but our journey in this lifetime is towards wholeness. And wholeness means being able to embody that. And it does happen, it happens hormonally as well, right? As testosterone decreases, men become more gentle as they age. As women, as they age, and their hormones decrease, they actually become more assertive and stronger. But we don't have to wait for the hormonal effects. We can actually have that wisdom occur to us. So it really is a question of understanding and honoring both sides of the pole, not making one right and one wrong. The simplest example of this, I think Barry uses is breathing. You can say that we human beings need oxygen to breathe. I mean, to live, right? Without oxygen, we don't live. And therefore, breathing in is so important. Right? So I really prefer breathing in. Or breathing out, I have to do. But what happens if you just focus on breathing in? You end up with carbon dioxide buildup inside you. And then, of course, you release that, and then you have the relief that comes from that. But if you stay there, then you have oxygen deprivation. So there's a natural cycling between that, right? breathing in and breathing out. And that's really what polarities are like. There's a natural cycling between those. We may have a preference or a tendency towards one, but that doesn't mean we should disregard the other, right? And we need to have a way of knowing when we're going too far. So the polarity mapping framework of Barry Johnson, when we're in one side of that, then when we become excessive there and you drop below the line and you start to then experience the unhealthy manifestations of too much masculine or too much feminine. So there's some kind of early warning sign why I'm getting too aggressive or I'm getting too, so I need to now bring in some of that healthy feminine. So there's an early warning sign, and then there's an action step that you can take. So to sort of ground yourself back into the opposite pole in the positive side. And when you go too low there, then you can. So I think that is really the dance between these energies that we have to master. And we talk about my partner Nilima Bhatt and I co-author on the book Shakti Leadership, where we write about this at great detail. And we've now expanded that to say it's not just masculine, feminine, but there's also the elder and the child within us. The elder energy, which is the meaning, purpose, wisdom, legacy, that energy that comes from the wise elder. And there's the healthy child, which is playfulness, joy, laughter, creativity. All of that comes from being connected to the healthy child energy. And ultimately, what we want to do is to manifest the healthy versions of all four. Right? The healthy elder, the healthy father, the healthy mother, and the healthy child within us, and be able to call on those things, all those four energies, as needed. And the shorthand for that, which I love, which my co-author Nilima coined, is the wise fool of tough love. And you become your own version, the wise fool. You have the wisdom of the elder, right? The foolishness, the light-heartedness, the lightness of being of the child, right? And you've got the toughness of the strong father and the love of the unconditional love of the mother. How can we stay? And that's staying above the line on all four. Now, it is very possible to be below the line on any or all of them, right? You can have sort of the unhealthy elder energy, which is dogmatism, superstition, right? Fear of change, etc. You can have the unhealthy child energy, which is kind of the adolescent, self-indulgent, impatient, selfish. And of course, you can have the unhealthy masculine, unhealthy feminine. And I think that's what we have to strive to be, manifest all four of those positive energies within us.
Well, I wrote down the wise fool of tough love. As you could tell by my laughter, that one resonated with me. Everything resonates a lot with me, and I want to help you keep rolling here. So one thing I'm curious about is how you have done your own healing work towards wholeness and integration of all of these qualities. Like what has been supportive in your own personal journey to become closer to the wise fool of tough love in any given moment?
Yeah, so this I would say is a really relatively recent chapter in my life. A lot of this healing work, a lot of this growth is probably in the last 5 to 10 years. I discovered my purpose. The subtitle of my book is The Path to Purpose, Inner Peace and Healing. And that's the sequence in which it happened for me. I discovered my purpose, which is a very important element, of course, in Viktor Frankl and Man's Search for Meaning. It's all about that. That happened to me or for me around 2005 when I wrote the book Forms of Endearment. And even before it was published, I felt my purpose found me because I discovered a way of being that resonated with my core. And I was literally in tears as I was writing some of the stories of these companies that are loved by everybody. After 20 years of being in a world of business and as a professor of marketing and strategy, being part of a world that I felt very dehumanizing to me, very exploitative in many ways. It was all about making money, but no focus on well-being and happiness and society, or none of those elements were ever talked about in my business education and all the literature that existed at the time. And then I discovered this other way of being, right, which was rooted in love and care and meaning and purpose and the well-being of everybody at the same time. And that really resonated with me at a deep level, and I kind of discovered my purpose there. Right? So I find I had been following my heartbreak, as Andrew Harvey talks about until then. Things that I noticed that none of my doctoral student colleagues or my faculty colleagues, once I started teaching, none of them cared about those things. Very few of them did. But I really cared about them. The way we're using women's bodies to sell products, for example, what that does to young women, eating disorders and body dysmorphia and depression, and a host of other things, with children and elders, and many other, just even regular people, when we spend so much on marketing, which was my field. And so I found that my purpose kind of found me. I went from the heartbreak to the bliss. I saw the other side, that heartbreak, right? As Joseph Campbell says, follow your bliss. And Andrew Harvey says, follow your heartbreak. And in those, between those two, somewhere is your purpose. What breaks your heart? What brings you joy? That was. So I discovered that, but there was still a lot more that I needed to do from a healing side. I had meaning and purpose in my life, but I did not have peace. And I had all these wounds that I had never even acknowledged, let alone heal. And so that journey has been over the last 10, 15 years, especially in the last 5 years. The need for healing. When I was writing the Healing Organization, the book that came out in 2019, but I really was doing the research in 2017, and then in 18, I was getting ready to write. That's the year I turned 60. And I was gathering the stories and doing the background work and so forth. And I carved out the entire summer of 2018, a series of writing retreats. I like to block out like 1 or 2 weeks at a time, go somewhere in the mountains or somewhere, and they just, work day and night. That's how I've done most of my books. 4 women asked me the same question. They said, Raj, you're writing a book about healing. What about your own healing? And I initially said, well, I don't have time for that. I've got a book deadline in October, so I need to just focus. They said, no, you need to make time for that. I said, well, I think I'm okay. They said, no, we know you, and everybody needs healing. And especially you, and you really cannot write a book about healing unless you have focused on your own healing. I mean, that just would not be, almost ethically right? To talk about something, but not actually try to look within and apply it. And so fortunately, I had the good sense to listen to them. Lynn Twist was one of them, and Nilima, my co-author, was another, and my coach, and then somebody else I worked with who had guided me on some plant journeys. And so then I listened to them. I delayed that book by 5 months. And I said yes to a number of experiences that I had already turned down, including going to the high Himalayas, the border between India and Tibet, in a region called Ladakh, which is the seat of deep Buddhist wisdom. Tibetan Buddhism, and that the Indian version of that comes from that region. And that's where I had my 60th birthday on a Shakti spiritual journey that we organized, the Shakti leadership groups. And that was very profound. And then I went to a silent retreat for several days with 35 people in upstate New York at a place called Peace Village. And that was a profound experience. And in that silence, I received so many downloads, so much wisdom came flowing through me that I had 45 pages of notes by the end of that. And I said, oh my God, I need to write another book. I kind of had the framing for this book that started to come to me. And then I worked with a coach for the first time, and that was profound for me, the insights that she had for me. And then I went to the Amazon rainforest with Lynn Twist on the Pachamama Alliance. And Lynn had called me the day after I interviewed her for my book, and she said, Raj, I had a dream last night and you were in it, and the message was very clear that you need to come on this trip, that you will learn more about healing in 10 days, being immersed in the rainforest with the indigenous people there, the Achwar and the Zapanda. You will learn far more about healing than any amount of academic research that you could do. So those all became major steps in my healing journey. And that continued into 2019. That's when I realized some of the traumas that had been buried inside my psyche and in my family history that I write about. It also soon was followed by both of my parents dying. That is its own kind of a growth experience. So yeah, it's been quite an intense few years of rapid and deep learning and growth for me.
Could you talk about the healing circle that you organized with your family and some of the events that precipitated that you felt it was important enough to not only for your family, but for Kasur, where you're from, the little village in India that you grew up in? It was really moving. And I think there's another through line that I want to explore about this afterwards, but let's just start with the healing circle that you organized. What precipitated it? What were some of the events that you wanted to unearth, uncover with your family? And what's become possible in your family, your personal life, however you'd want to describe it, even maybe a bigger collective, as a result of the healing? Because in my estimation, a lot of us look at healing as, I don't know, only something to do if we're wounded more than another person. But I think that all of us need to do our own healing work, and that there's so much that's possible on the other side. It's that bliss that you're speaking about. But I'll let you take it from here and talk about the healing circle.
Sure. Well, the healing circle is something I write about in the epilogue of the book. It's the very last section of the book. Because a few chapters earlier, I had uncovered certain deep traumas that had existed in my family. Um, and even before that, I had uncovered my own traumas, some of which I was aware of and others I had erased. And so I realized that there's trauma at four levels. There's personal trauma, things that happen directly to you, right? Or as Gabor Mate would say, things that happened that should not have happened and things that did not happen that should have happened, right? And both can be traumatic, right? So I discovered, or I knew about some of them, but I discovered a deeper level of personal trauma that I had experienced and not yet healed from. And then there's family trauma, things that happened within the family system that I was not alive for when that incident happened, the traumatic incident. But I've lived in the shadow of that my entire life. And the energy system that I was part of was really deeply, deeply wounded and impacted by that traumatic event 75 years ago. And then there's a third kind of trauma, which is ancestral trauma, things that happened multi generations ago. We are now, and this is very new research that is still unfolding, that through the field of epigenetics, we are discovering that certain genes get expressed in some people in different ways depending on their lineage. Right? So they may have certain exaggerated fears of certain things or sensitivity to certain things because of things that happened 4, 5, 6 generations ago, that the genes are being expressed in a different way. So in a way, your lineage, the trauma that people experienced in the past is still sitting inside you, unacknowledged and unhealed for the most part. And then there's the collective trauma, what we have all experienced. Climate change is kind of a shared collective trauma. The pandemic was a deeply traumatic event, more for some people than others, but overall at a planetary level, even Ukraine. I mean, there are many traumatic things that happen in the world. So there's trauma of all kinds. And I came to recognize that we are all in some state of post-traumatic stress injury, PTSI, maybe not PTSD, maybe we don't have a diagnosed disorder. Maybe that diagnosis is reserved for people with first responders or people who were sent away to battle in war and things that we can't imagine. But the fact is that trauma is universal. It's part of the human condition. It has happened for every one of us, I believe. Just routinely growing up is hard, and the traumatic events that happen in every child's life. And then there are other things that happen to people that are more intense than that. So there was all this trauma, and I was aware of some of it. But the two biggest pieces were unfolded to me in 2019 when I was on a walk with my cousin, and he told me two things that really shook me in that walk. So I had this difficult history with my father. I didn't know him until I was 7, as I mentioned earlier. And then I never got close to him after that, partly because we missed those 7 bonding years, which I can't imagine missing that with my children, right? Like you barely know that you don't get close. But then also, I never felt worthy of him. I was always trying to impress him. He never approved of me. He never expressed any of those things. So I had a difficult time. But then I left home before I was 16, and I only periodically saw him after that. But when it came time for me to get married, it became a big issue between him and me because he wanted me to go through the arranged process and somebody that he would approve of. And I met somebody that I wanted to marry, and he completely put his foot down and said no. And I said, well, it's my life. I'm going to do it. But then he came to Boston, spent several months trying to do everything possible to break us up and get me to change. Nothing worked. He said, I curse your marriage if you marry this person. Forget about blessing you. I'm going to curse you. Whether you believe it or not, those words have power. And then finally, when nothing worked, he threatened to kill himself. He literally cut himself with a knife one night after having multiple drinks. And I don't know whether he did it in a calculating way that he thought he was trying to pull out all the stops to get me to do, but I essentially almost fainted in that moment. I remember everything just going black and I just collapsed to the floor because I could see all the blood. And it was very traumatic. So that was a traumatic imprint. And then I gave in that moment. Um, and then, he left. My mom was there too, but this was all his doing, really. And then over the next few weeks, I slowly came back to my senses, and I said, I cannot let him dictate my life. This is my life, even if it's a mistake. He cannot. If I give in to him on this, I will never be my own person. It's a matter of self-respect. It became that. It became about him and me. The person I was marrying almost became incidental in that battle, if you will. And so when I came to that realization, I said, no, this is my life, my choice. I went to India and I went to tell him personally that I will, in fact, marry her. This is my life. And he blew up all over again. And this time he went into the other room and he came back with a gun, right? And he pointed that gun at me and said some version of, I would rather not have a son than a son like you, right? And my cousins and others were there, and they came between us and took me away from there. But now this was a deeply trauma. You can imagine the level of trauma of that kind of an event. It was so traumatic that I experienced what is called dissociative amnesia, where your psyche, in order to protect you, erases certain painful memories because they're too hard for you to live with. So it just erases that. Right? Now, I wouldn't have believed that's possible unless in 2019 I went on that walk with my cousin and I asked him what happened that day. Tell me what happened in the aftermath. He said, "Yeah, this is what happened. This is what he said. This is the gun he brought. This is what There are multiple people who were there who confirmed these details, and I had no memory of it. Now, the fact that I don't have a conscious memory of it doesn't mean that it's gone from my right. The book, like the book says, the body keeps the score. It's all embedded in me, right? So that trauma is something I've been living with and carrying around. And then he told me on that same walk about a second. I said, what is this curse that Papa, I call my father Papa. My father used to talk about this curse. He said, our family, people say that there's a curse on our family, that there were two souls that died an unnatural death, and they never found peace, and therefore our family has been cursed. That's what people say. And he would just say that, right? And in a way, trying to make sense of all of the suffering that has happened in our family. There were suicides, there were children dying young, there were murders, just enormous amount of suffering, inordinate amount of suffering and pain in the family. And I asked my cousin, what is this curse? Do you know anything about this curse? He said, yeah, I know what that is. Really? What is it? He said, our grandfather had 13 children. I only know about 6 of them. Right? He said 6 of them died when they were young. In those days, infant mortality, child mortality was very high, right? That's kind of par for the course. So 6 died and 6 survived, but there was a 13th one. And he said, we had another aunt, and she was the second oldest of all of them. And that she became pregnant, or she was raped, we believe, by the priest in the village, who was kind of a trusted spiritual advisor to the family. And this happened, she was probably like 16 years old, and she became pregnant. And around the time that her older brother was getting married, she started to show signs of her pregnancy. And people started gossiping. And that's how my grandfather found out about it. Because he hardly ever saw his daughters, and they always stayed in the inside part of the house. And to him, this was going to completely bring shame and dishonor on the family. Everything that he had worked hard to create and build up for this family and all the respect and prestige in the world, or whatever the way he saw it, it's going to destroy to have this happen and for people to know about it. And the story goes that he told his oldest son that you need to take care of this problem, right? Because you're the oldest and this is your duty. And so essentially his oldest son had to figure out a way to essentially get rid of his own sister. And the details are different than what I've heard, and they're in the book, but I don't have to go there. But basically, she was killed and her child died. And she was almost 9 months pregnant at that time, 8.5 months. So the baby was born, the baby was crying, and they somehow, and that one night, both of them were erased. And the next day, it was like she never existed. Nobody's ever supposed to talk about her. And that was that. And now this uncle, who was apparently a very gentle, loving soul, from what I've been told, started exhibiting signs of madness. He started having these outbursts and screaming and shouting at people and being out of control. And then he would calm down again. And then slowly over the period of the next few years, those outbursts became more and more frequent. Ultimately, he was completely, fully mad, ranting and raving and screaming and lashing out day and night, to the point where he was locked up in a room in that house for the rest of his life. He lived another 20 years or so. And that was the background soundtrack. So when I came of awareness, growing up there, all I heard was he was known as Kumar Sahab, which is kind of like the heir apparent to my grandfather for that feudal title that we had. Um, he was ranting and raving. You could hear him from a mile away, and there was that room in the corner. And once in a while, he would calm down, and you could see him, and they would give him food. But he was usually naked and chained to a post, and ranting and raving day and night. So this was kind of the episode or incident that I learned about in 2019, and I said, "Oh my God, so much makes sense now. That here's this family that has been living with this dark secret." This collective, this trauma that inflicted was, that impacted all of us, everybody in this family. And my father and others were all witnesses to this atrocity, but they were not allowed to talk about it. Certainly, there was no concept of therapy or anything that we would have access to today, right? So he was sworn to silence for the rest of his life, bottled that up, right? And it's kind of a loss of innocence. He was apparently a very idealistic young man, very intelligent, very, and he kind of his innocence was taken from him that day. And so he carried around that trauma for the rest of his life, and I believe that explains why he had to drink heavily every day. He had to take sleeping pills, to get some peace, some joy. The only time I saw him smile or be happy was after a few drinks. And then once that wore off, he needed the sleeping pills to be able to fall asleep at night. So he was a deeply troubled person with never any peace of mind. So this was kind of the backdrop. And when I learned about this, I said, two things. So one, I can't write about this in the book unless I take it all the way to healing. I can't just put it in as a salacious, gossipy kind of, oh my God, shocking detail. What trauma we say you have to reveal it and feel it in order to heal it. But you have to try to get to healing. So I said, how can we get to healing? And my friend Nilima and others guided me on that. The idea of the healing circle, that we have to, first of all, bring this into the open, right? What do most people do with trauma, like my father did? We conceal it, we hide it, we're ashamed of it, right? And that shame grows in that darkness. We conceal it and then we numb it. We numb it with drugs and alcohol most commonly, or other escape mechanisms. Some people might run or whatever, but there are still escape mechanisms. You're not actually addressing it. So we conceal it, we numb it, and then we relive it constantly. It's never gone. And the other pathway is you reveal it and feel it and grieve it in order to start to heal it. And there are other things available today, many modalities like psychedelics and MDMA that people are being able to use to heal trauma. So I said we need to acknowledge this at a for the whole family. Now, many people in my family were against that. My brother and others said, no, you can't talk about this. You certainly cannot write about this. What are people going to think about our family? That people are going to laugh at us, or that people will not want their children to marry our children because we'll be tainted by this history. And I said, well, I don't think that's true. And secondly, I cannot be part of the conspiracy of silence anymore. This thing has been buried for 75 years. We've seen all the trauma. I want to honor the memory of my aunt. She was the victim here. By the way, nothing happened to that priest. Okay, he suffered no consequences. She lost her life. She was killed. Her memory was erased. I asked around. I tried to find out what was her name. What was she like? There are only a few survivors still. There are two siblings that are left. And I said I want the entire family to come together. And first of all, some of the and my other cousins said, well, we should not include the young people. They should not be part of that. I said, no, they need to be part of this. This is their lineage as well. None of us are guilty of this crime, but we are all part of the system within which this happened, right? And we all have some collective responsibility here, because we're the only ones who can try to do something today to heal. I think in the present moment, you can heal the present, but you can also heal the past in the present moment, right? That whole truth and reconciliation idea that South Africa showed us, right? At the end of apartheid, without truth, there's no reconciliation, there's no harmony, there's no peace. First, the truth has to be acknowledged. So I said, we're going to talk about what happened. To the best of my knowledge, from what I've been able to piece together, this is what I know. And I asked other people in the room what they've heard. So we got that, the details of what we think might have happened that night. And we talked about, what else do we know about this? And then how can we collectively as a family now express our remorse, our grief, regret that this happened. I especially wanted the women to speak, because again, I come from that tradition which still exists, where the women are sort of sidelined and they don't speak, right? They kind of, some of them keep their head covered, and I had a microphone I passed around. I said, I want to hear everybody's voice. And what do you think about this? What should we do going forward? I wanted the young men, especially in the family, to have a different reverence for the feminine, because this was the extinguishing of the feminine within our family. This was a crime against the feminine, right? Literally, the woman and her baby were killed for no fault of their own, but because of the abuses of the masculine, the patriarchal system that we were in. And so we had that process that evening. And the other part of it, I said, we need to connect back, if you talk about the ancestral piece of this. We are born, the caste system, and I don't approve of the caste system, and I think it has caused so much suffering for people in the lower caste who are considered untouchable. I mean, it's one of the saddest things about the Indian, the heritage that we are, system that we were part of. But I said, if we do in fact buy into this notion that we are from the warrior community, the warrior caste, the Rajputs, well, what is our dharma as Rajputs? Dharma is kind of the sacred duty that we are here to perform, right? What we are supposed to live into. Yeah, if you're born into this privileged position, and we had all this land and these titles and all this respect that people gave us, unearned in a way, right? Just born into that. I said, what is our sacred duty? Well, as warriors, what is our role? We are the ones who are supposed to sacrifice ourselves to protect the people. That's the history, right? Because India has been invaded 200 times in its history, more than any other country on the planet. And the invasions always came from the Northwest, from the Middle East, from Arabia and other countries, Afghanistan, Greece, etc. And my ancestors were at the forefront of those battles, because I come from that state of Rajasthan, which is on the northwest frontier. These were the warriors there, right? So they went into, time and again, went into these battles, facing certain death against much larger armies, right? But they had to do it. And their wives and children often committed mass suicide because they didn't want to be enslaved and tortured and so forth. So there's all that traumatic history in our lineage, right? But core to it is our fundamental duty. I said, so we need to connect to our dharma. And I went around the room and said, what should we commit to as the family of in Kesur? We have got this village, we have all these people, right, who are in much weaker positions than we are. What has happened in the last few generations that we have become the abusers instead of the protectors and the defenders. I saw it growing up. My grandfather, my uncles, my cousins, they would all use their power to abuse the workers, abuse the people physically, mentally, emotionally, sexually, in every possible way, right? We became the tormentors and the abusers of the people. We can disconnect it from our sacred duty. I said, we must recommit to becoming the protectors and defenders and servants in a way of the people there, right? So that people can look to us for help, right? That we can actually help make their lives better rather than use them to make more money and wealth for ourselves. And so we went around the room to get people to commit to that. One of my cousins were running for election in some local, election there in the village. And I said, why do you want to do this? Why do you want to get elected into this role? Do you view it as a sacred responsibility to help the people? Or are you just going to use it to try to make more money? Which is what a lot of politicians do in India and many places, right? They get bribed to do certain things for certain people, and that's why many people spend money to become elected. So we had that kind of a conversation, and a lot of people committed to say, yeah, as a family, we need to come back together with each other, and we need to support each other, and we need to support our community and the people around us, and so forth. So I think it became a really pivotal moment, I think, in our history, because no conversation like this had ever happened before. So I think people will remember this, and I recorded all of it. And then the next day, we did a religious ceremony as well, where we had the priest, and we actually had an altar at which we had a representation of my aunt and her baby, and my parents and grandparents and everybody. And there's kind of it's a ceremony to for the lineage, for our ancestors, for people. And we finally honored those two souls who had never received any of that kind of honoring in any ceremony, right? And if you're a believing Hindu, then you believe that if you don't do that, then those souls will not find peace. So we did all those things. And so I think, it then made it okay to talk about this, because we have now tried to heal from it, learn from it, grow from it, commit to being about our higher selves, right? Rather than give in to those baser things. And I think our story is not unique, maybe a little more extreme. But there are probably many families like that, especially in that feudal culture that we come from, the Rajputs, who would recognize a version. My cousin said, yeah, this kind of stuff used to happen all the time. That many daughters and daughters-in-law, of these families were literally killed right in the house and disappeared over whatever reasons over the centuries. That would happen, and so maybe this inspires other people to also try to find healing. First of all, to bring the truth into the room, and then find healing. Some kind of, like we have the Me Too over here, some kind of a we too. Yeah, we too. Our family also had this darkness in it. There's tremendous amount of that all over the world. So that really was the intent of including those things. My own personal trauma with me and my father, and the family trauma. So we can actually now start to heal from those once you acknowledge it. The first step, as James Baldwin said, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. So this is sort of step 1 and 2 in that journey, facing it, and now starting to try to move towards some kind of reconciliation. And I believe a lot of that happened that day for us.
Well, it's such a powerful story. And I have a really big question, a really big follow-up question for you, Raj, because globally, we are built on a lot of the same challenges that your family was built on. Patriarchy, there's lots of extraction, what you would call unconscious capitalism. America is built on slavery, colonialism. There's just so much collective trauma and personal trauma, but it's inescapable. And so the big question I have behind this is that if you were to orchestrate a global healing circle, what would that look like?
Yeah, I think that's a very profound question, and I agree with you that this is universal to the human condition. Almost everybody can trace back to either being on the side of the traumatized, or the people inflicting the trauma. And I think when you inflict trauma on another, that is its own trauma, right? The slave owner who whipped their slaves, they're also damaging their psyche in some deep way. And so I think the coming together and recognizing, there was a beautiful quote from an actor named Mehcad Brooks, I think, African American actor. He was on a podcast I heard, and he said to the host of the podcast, um, that your ancestors will never, or you will never understand the ancestral trauma that I carry. Okay. And I may never understand the ancestral guilt that you carry. But our ancestors would sure love it if we could now heal together, right? By acknowledging, first of all. I had a friend from Trinidad who just went to Guyana and visited the slave castles, I think they were called, where the slave trade was really organized, right? Slaves were captured, and from there they were shipped out to the West. And he just had this profound connection with the trauma that sits in his lineage. He had grown up kind of in denial, right? As a black child, a Nigerian father, and then a mother who came, I think, from Africa, from the other side of Africa. And all through, he was like, "Oh, we're just like everybody else." And he grew up in a middle class family and well educated. Went to Harvard and went to Wharton and worked at McKinsey and is a CEO of a big company. And his children said to him, "Dad, you never talked to us about race. You know, we never because yeah, they were trying to pretend like it wasn't there. Right? It's not an issue. We're fine. We're succeeding. We're thriving here." And this was really after reading my book, and then he had that experience there. And now he really wants to look at this head on, and is coming now to, understand his own deep trauma that has been buried. And he himself then said, "Yeah, I've experienced being treated or thought of as less than, even as a student in school, even when I was working." But he had again chosen not to see those things or to discount them, pretend like they didn't happen. So I think again, it's about the truth. And this was a big theme in my book, as you read, the final lessons that I got from that ayahuasca experience. Truth was the last piece of it, right? We have to face the truth, bring the truth in the room. So I do believe we need that, as you said, in this country, in the United States. We have done an especially poor job of healing the past because we have kind of said, okay, we had the war and we did the thing, we passed the laws, and now we move on, right? And all that is in the past, and nothing can be done or nothing needs to be done about it. Well, the fact is that we have never fully acknowledged the real suffering at a heart level. Maybe we passed some laws and then for 100 years again things were bad, right? But I don't think we've done that, either for the slavery issue or the native population, or some other things as well in our history. I think that's something that's part of the maturing of our national psyche that is needed. There was this phrase that being American means never having to say you're sorry, right? And in a way, that is not American to go out and apologize to anybody in the world for anything that we ever did. I remember when Obama went to Japan and he expressed some regret, not even an apology, the regret that the other atomic bomb had to be dropped here. And you could argue all of that, pros and cons. But even that was, oh my God, how can you apologize for America? So I think that is something that we need to change. And so I think that healing circle needs to bring together both sides, the people who were predominantly on the side of the traumatized and those who did that. And we cannot heal in isolation from each other. The traumatized can't heal without the presence of the tormentors. And this is where I think Desmond Tutu and Nelson Mandela gave us that beautiful blueprint: truth and reconciliation. Let's have those conversations at every level. Let's acknowledge, let's heal together, because we can't heal without each other. Not really. So I think there's a huge need for that, and a huge opportunity. I haven't thought about what that global conversation would look like, but I think that is something to aspire to do. My partner, my co-author Nilima Bhatt, does do truth and reconciliation. In fact, it's going on right now. There's an online truth and reconciliation 2-week process that she's doing. A number of different speakers are talking to different aspects of that. So yeah, that's certainly something that is needed.
Mm-hmm. It seems, I mean, one of the things I'm hearing in your answer, and if you were to ask me, it's a gigantic question, and there isn't really, I don't know if there's a right answer per se, but one of the things I'm hearing in your response that feels true to me is that it's multifaceted. There's lots of layers. So we could do our own individual healing around what has happened directly to us. There's
Yes.
the collective of, if I'm white, and if I was in a healing circle with someone who is black or is a person of color, there would be hopefully a skillful facilitator there who could help guide us on some sort of journey inwards where we are able to make a repair. And in your example, not ignore the fact that race is a challenge that's present right now.
Yeah.
When we ignore it, we are doing more damage. It's probably well intended by a lot of people, but we do more damage. And so I think that that's what you're pointing to in the answer, is that there needs to be multiple levels of this. It's not a sit down of let's bring 9 billion people together and talk about this. your own healing work that you might do with a therapist or a coach. There's your familial inner work that you could do, which is what you did in your healing circle. And then you might do race, class. There's gender.
Gender as well. Yeah, we do these gender reconciliation circles coming out of our Shakti leadership work, where we actually put men and women together. And we start by putting the women in the inner circle and the men in the outer circle, right? So everybody is facing a fire in the middle, and then there's a talking stick. And first, the women speak, and they speak to a number of different questions that we ask them about their fears, about their hopes, about their dreams, about all kinds of deep things. What it feels like to be a woman in this world, right? What are some of the things that are unique to women, especially in terms of physical safety, for example, but also in terms of being treated with respect and as an equal and so. And the men are there to bear witness, right? Not to respond, not to speak, but just to listen deeply at a deep level, not just for the words, but the emotions and the pain and the values underlying those words, right? And then we change it, and the men are in the inner circle, and the women are then bearing witness. And yeah, being a man is no picnic either in this world, and there's all kinds of challenges, right, that are faced. There's in many ways a crisis for men too right now in this in the world, especially young boys, but even for men. And so that becomes a very healing process because each of us kind of represents the archetype. Yeah, we're not just telling our individual story. We're speaking on behalf of our collective, the feminine or the masculine, and the other needs to hear that, right? And then respond to it and adjust based upon that and shift certain ways of being and certain ways of thinking from that. And I think some version of that, we haven't done it with races, but I think that would be a powerful thing to do. And I'm going to take that as an idea, and I'm going to talk about it with Niliman because my friend in Trinidad is asking what should he do with this, this state that he's in right now. He's opened up and he's feeling, he's now seeing things that he didn't see before. He's talking about doing a TED talk maybe about this, and that's fine. But what is the bigger healing opportunity that has opened up from this? How do we do that? So yeah, I agree. I agree with that.
I feel really inspired by much of this conversation so far, Raj. And there's a couple of things that I want to make sure we hit on before we wrap up here. And one is just around the place of healing in business. I mean, you are doing the intersection of healing and business. That's an instrumental part of your purpose with conscious capitalism. And so a lot of what we were talking about so far today, to me, it's imperative for businesses to be looking at this work too. And so how do you look at the intersection of healing and business? And yeah, I guess if you could just talk a little bit about the idea of conscious capitalism as well.
Sure. Well, I wrote a book called The Healing Organization in 2019, which was kind of the evolution in my mind of the philosophy of conscious capitalism, which was rooted for me in a book I wrote called Firms of Endearment that I mentioned earlier. That's how I discovered my purpose, right? Companies that are loved by everybody, and what makes that happen is that they practice these four principles, that they have a reason for being, a purpose that goes beyond profit, and they have some core values that are germane to them, that they care about the well-being of everybody whose life is impacted by that business, the employees, their children, communities, customers, suppliers, investors, everybody, right? That everybody's well-being matters as an end in itself, not just as a way to make more money for the owner of the business, but as an end in itself. Everybody connected to the business matters and everybody should thrive. Third is conscious leadership, which is about leaders who are primarily motivated by service to the people and to the purpose of the organization, not driven by their ego and by hunger for money and power. And so conscious leaders are elevated in that sense, that they are operating with that as their primary drive. And then the culture of these companies, where most traditional cultures have a lot of fear and stress in them. We kind of use this metaphor of carrots and sticks to get people to do things or behave, right? And we say, what animal belongs between a carrot and a stick? It's not a human, it's a donkey. And that's where that metaphor comes from. But we treat people like that. And as a result, we create tremendous stress, tremendous fear, tremendous burnout. My partner is publishing a book on burnout in the next 2 months, which is epidemic levels in the world. Tremendous suffering. Heart attacks are 20% higher on Mondays. 4 a.m. Monday morning is the peak of heart attacks. 120,000 Americans die from stress connected to work. 600,000 Chinese die every year from too much work. Right? I mean, the human cost of doing business is extraordinary. And conscious companies have cultures that are caring, that respect and honor the people that are in them. There's trusting, there's transparency, integrity, all kinds of empowerment, and so forth. So those are the four pillars that we discovered. They define what it means to be a conscious business or a firm of endearment. And we found that those companies actually are more successful financially in the long run. Even though that's not their primary motivation, they're doing it because this is the right thing to do. They're not saying, well, we treat people better and they're happier, they'll be more productive and more creative, which is all true. But that's not why you do it. You do it because it's the right thing to do. That's what we as humans are called on to do. We're here to take care of each other and serve each other. And so my research found that those companies are dramatically more successful, not just a little bit. And at the same time, they're having many other positive effects on people, right? Physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, socially, ecologically, all kinds of positive impacts in addition to financially. So that kind of became a compelling story of rethinking everything I had been taught in my business, MBA and PhD, which is rooted in this narrow view of human beings, Homo economicus. We are selfish, material, individual, short-term value maximizers. They're like, what's in it for me, and how can I get as much of it as possible? As opposed to we are altruistic, we are loving, we are caring. We have all these other dimensions to ourselves. But the whole world of economics and capitalism has been built on that one pillar alone. And actually goes back to that's masculine energy, right? That is saying I'm in it for, and I win and everybody else has to lose if I do that. We left out the other side of what it means to be a human being. In fact, Adam Smith, who wrote Wealth of Nations, which is about self-interest and pursuing and freedom, and in a way, he also wrote the theory of moral sentiments about the human need to care, which came 17 years before the Wealth of Nations. And the way I say it is that capitalism had a mother and a father, and they were both Adam Smith. The father energy was in Wealth of Nations. The mother energy was in moral sentiments. But what do we do in life, as I did for many decades? You take your mother for granted. And you run after what your father is out there conquering in the world. And we think that's what it's all about, right? So we ignored that feminine side, the caring side. So we built business and capitalism on one pillar. We left out the caring and we left out the hunger for purpose, right? Beyond self-interest, which Viktor Frankl writes so beautifully about. And so we're trying to create a three-dimensional, not just one pillar, but three pillars on which business should rest: caring, self-interest, and purpose. So that became Conscious Capitalism and became a movement starting in 2008. We wrote the book Conscious Capitalism in 2013. It's become a global movement. We have chapters in many countries and about 35 US cities. And, it's part of the conversation now. And, there are others also talking about this in their own language. And so that journey for me that started in 2005 when I wrote Films of Endearment, came out in 2007, has continued over the years. I started exploring some of the other dimensions, like Shakti leadership was about the feminine, and my recognition that these companies have a lot more feminine energy in them. And there's a rise of feminine values in the culture generally. We're moving away from war, we're moving away from violence, etc. So that was Shakti, and then there was a book called Everybody Matters, which is about democratizing this to every kind of business, right? Small companies, manufacturing companies, etc. When you put people at the center, treat them with respect and care and dignity, so that everybody matters and everybody wins. That's ultimately, that's the story of one company that has done that beautifully. And then ultimately, I came to this realization that business is ultimately about reducing suffering and bringing more joy into the world if you do it right. But if you do it with the old mindset, it actually increases suffering and takes away joy. Okay, the traditional businesses, which are just about profit maximization, they come in and they fire a bunch of people and put everybody else on these aggressive targets, and you're running faster just to stay in place, and you're burning out and you're stressed out, and increasing earnings per share by a penny or two. And that's just like causing suffering. And you end up selling more than you need to customers who don't need it, and you charge them whatever you can, and you end up causing bad health for your customers and stress and burnout for your employees and damage the environment and destroy the communities, and you made your money. And I say, well, that's not real profit. That's like a parasite. You're just sucking value. You're sucking life force out of people, out of the planet, right? In order to make money. And so that's not. So I said the same business can be done, right? Same product, same customers, same employees. You can do it in a way that causes suffering, or you can do it in a way that reduces suffering and elevates joy. And so the idea of the healing organization came out of that, that if you do it in the right way, you can actually, if you meet somebody's need with genuine care, I understand your needs and I meet those needs with genuine care for you, not just because I see how many dollars you can give me. That's a healing act. But if I really look at you as a way to fulfill my needs of making more money, then I'm going to do whatever it takes to get separate you from your money, right? And I'll do that in the employees, etc. So that becomes suffering. So that was the idea that business, in fact, the way we traditionally practice it, causes enormous suffering in the world. There's so much suffering out there. We've raised living standards, true, but if you look at burnout, you look at stress, anxiety, depression, drug addiction, suicides, these are all going up rapidly all over the world, especially developed countries. If you look at the amount of suffering that we have out there on the planetary level, we're living through the fifth mass extinction, first one after 65 million years now, caused primarily by human activity. Right? Half the species are going to disappear in the next few decades. If you look at the amount of suffering that we are creating with factory farmed animals, something like, I don't know, 70 billion animals are kept in these cages and horrific conditions, and then they are killed in order to feed our appetites. That's an enormous, enormous, unimaginable amount of suffering that's going on every day. We don't see it, right? We just see the nicely packaged product in the supermarket or in a restaurant. But there's enormous suffering out there that is being conducted or inflicted on our behalf, right? And I believe all suffering matters. It doesn't disappear when that animal dies. And there's some karmic accounting somewhere of all the suffering that we are directly or indirectly causing in the world. And so to me, the paramount, I say we need to heal ourselves, our families, our communities, our companies, our countries, our planet, and we need to heal the past and the present and the future. So the need for healing is paramount. And we all need to be healers. It doesn't matter if you're a professor or a CEO or an engineer or a doctor or a lawyer. You can think of yourself as a healer. Am I a healer? Am I reducing suffering and bringing more joy? And that book then looks at 25 companies that are actually healing their employees. There are places of healing for their people who work there. There are sources of healing for their customers and their communities. And they are a force for healing in the world. And that's what we can do and we can aspire to. And there's these very practical and inspirational stories of 25 companies that are doing that. So I think the workplace can become the place of deepest spiritual growth. And we can heal at scale. See, in our normal life, I can only take care of a few people and have a positive impact on a handful of others, right? But if you start a company, you can multiply that. I think business is a way to scale caring and healing. But you have to start out with the healing business. So again, this is not saying we need more yoga, and massage and wellness retreat centers. This is not about saying we need more healing businesses. This is saying we need to treat business itself as a healing activity, right? Doing the right things for the right reasons with the right energy, then that will heal. You do those same things in a different way, that will hurt. So that's the idea of that. I think, as I said, business, my friend John Mackey, who's the CEO of Whole Foods or the founder of Whole Foods, and we wrote that book together. We started this movement together. He said, Whole Foods is my ashram. That is where I do my deepest spiritual work. That's how it should be. Work is, as Khalil Gibran said, work is love made visible if you do it right. But if you don't, the work is then torture. made visible, right? We create these horrific work conditions and people burn out and stress out. And most people in this world, their workplace feels like a prison to them. Right? They have no freedom and they have no respect and they can't wait to get out. It doesn't have to be that way. That's what we're trying to change.
So one of my favorite examples of this in action is with, and you brought it to my awareness with one of your talks, Greyston Bakery, which is in Yonkers in New York. And could you just share a little bit about the way that that organization is run and how they're a healing, they're an ashram, if you will, for the
Yeah.
people who run it, the people who work there?
So every organization becomes a reflection of the founder's energy and the founding energy, right? Why did that thing come into being? And in this case, it was a Zen master named Bernie Glassman, who was literally trained as a rocket engineer. He worked for a company in Los Angeles, Lockheed Martin, one of those big guys. He had a PhD in rocket science, aeronautical engineering. But ultimately, he discovered Buddhism, and that's all about suffering and reducing suffering in the world. So he dedicated his life to reducing suffering. And his approach to doing that was very much along Buddhist principles, which is that you must first bear witness to the suffering of others. And from that bearing of witness, loving action will naturally arise. So, for example, being Jewish, he would take groups of people to Europe, right, to various Holocaust sites, right, so that they could then experience or in some way try to experience or feel what had happened in those places, right? And then come back and become activists on behalf of some of these causes to prevent some of the atrocities. One of the things he realized at some point, living in Yonkers, which has one of the highest per capita incomes of any county in the US, but also has one of the highest levels of homelessness of any county. And by the way, this is a common juxtaposition that we see, rich places that have a lot of suffering in them. The two of the places with the highest levels of suicide in the US are two of the richest zip codes, Aspen, Colorado, and Palo Alto, California, where Stanford University is located. Right? There's a lot of suffering alongside prosperity. But here, in this case, it was a lot of homeless people. And he started to say, how can I help ease some of that suffering? And so, of course, what he did was went and spent a week living with the homeless people. Took a group of people and they all spent that week on the streets. And they didn't bring any special resources or any ways to make it easier or more convenient for them. They actually tried to do it the way that people were living it. And at the end of that week, he had a sense of what he could do to alleviate this suffering. And he said what he found was that a lot of these people are people who never had a first chance. He said, forget about a second chance. There are millions of people in our country that never even get a first chance. Many people are born into these horrific surroundings, born into ghettos, surrounded by drugs and guns and violence at an early age, terrible schools, right? No real ladder of opportunity. And so they get caught up in that system at an early age. They might do something that gets them into trouble, and then that stigma stays with them the rest of their life. And the shocking recognition or realization that in this country, in the United States, which has the highest level of incarceration of any country in the world, in absolute numbers and as a percentage of the population. It's way higher than any country. You can think of North Korea or China or Venezuela, whatever you might think of might be the worst. No, we have numbers that are far worse. In fact, there are 70 million Americans that have a criminal record today. The same number that have a college degree, by the way. Okay, they're both in the 70s. This is one of what I call the social sadness. Every country has certain things about it that are cause deep suffering. It's kind of the social side. India is the caste system is one of them. In the US, I think our criminal justice system, and we have a medical system and others as well. But so he set about to do. He said, what happens? People get caught up in that system, and they then pay their dues. They get sent to jail. They serve time. They do all that, and then they come out. And now they want to get their life on track. And they look for a job, and what happens? Nobody wants to give them a job because there's a box you have to check on every application. Most applications, they say, have you ever been convicted or found guilty of a crime? If you check that box, most employers will close the door in your face. They will proudly say, we do not hire ex-convicts, we hire people, we do criminal background checks. Okay? It doesn't matter if it's a minor, 20 years ago you possessed 5 grams of marijuana and you were thrown away for 20 years because of the strict, 3 strikes and you're out or whatever, gun laws, incredibly harsh laws in this country. And so then you end up back on the street, people end up becoming addicted, they become homeless, right? They just suffer. And so he said, we're going to start a business. And what's the simplest business I can imagine is a bakery. You can train anybody to bake these things within a week, a few days. And so they pioneered this idea of open hiring. So no background checks and no interviews, right? And there's a register there. Now it's online, but it used to be a physical book. You go there and you put your name on it, and they hire the next name on that list. They just go down the list. And no questions asked, you're hired, you get 9 months of training, you get paid. And then at the end of those 9 months, you're put into a job. After which, of course, you have to meet the expectations, etc. But you've got to start it, right? And so, as he said, we don't hire people to bake brownies. We bake brownies to hire people, to get them started in their journey of life. And it's incredibly moving to see. We had one of their employees, Dion Drew, who came to our Conscious Capitalism conference in Philadelphia some years ago, and he was in tears as he was talking. He said, I've been in jail 3 times. The last time I came out after 3 years, and every time I pounded the pavement and I knocked on doors and I begged for a job, and nobody would give me a job. And then I'm starving and I have to go out there and do something to make some money. And you get caught up again and get arrested again. So this time I found Greyston. They gave me a job. They put me in training and gave me a job. And now he's a training supervisor. He's been there 5, 6 years at that time, and he's making $65,000 a year. He has a daughter. He has an apartment. He has a life. And he said, if it were not for Greyston, I would either be dead or back in jail. I owe them my life. So that's one of the stories in the book, and there are many like that people literally say, this is why I'm alive today. This company has enabled me to live, and actually experience life in a different way. So that's the power of business, and these are all for-profit businesses, right, that we're talking about, that can do this. Of course, nonprofits do healing work all the time, but in many ways, most nonprofits exist to heal the suffering that was caused by businesses or traditional ways of being in the world, right? We want to make it so that we don't cause the suffering in the first place. We should not need so many nonprofits. There are like 40 million NGOs out there trying to clean up the mess that we're creating by the way we do things out in the other part of the world, the rest of society. So yeah, that's an example of a great healing organization.
Still a couple more things, Raj, that I want to hit on with you. And this has been so much fun on my end so far, but you alluded to the list at various points. I think only truth and innocence maybe have come. I mean, love has probably come up as well, but I'm wondering if you could talk about how we could live by the list and what the list is and why it's so important.
Yeah, so this came to me as part of an ayahuasca journey that I took when I went on the Pachamama experience in Ecuador in 2018. This was with Lynn Twist and then that group, the Pachamama journey that they call it, Pachamama Alliance is the name of the organization. And we spent 10 days with the indigenous people learning about nature, our place in nature with the shamans, recognizing that, we don't come into this world, we come out of this world. And we are every much as part of nature as a tree or a butterfly, and yet we separate ourselves. Right? We're here and nature's over there, and therefore we end up exploiting and in many ways killing. In many ways we are committing matricide. We are destroying our mother, which is our planet. And that comes from that disconnection. So part of the purpose of that experience is to reconnect and ground yourself back with the nature and see not only the spirit, but the living vibrancy of everything out there and how we're all interconnected and interdependent. And the middle part of that trip is an ayahuasca experience, which is voluntary. I mean, it's optional. You don't have to do it, but I was very keen on it because I knew that is supposed to be a grandmother energy. That's supposed to connect you to Mother Earth, that plant. And it's kind of magical how the indigenous people of the Amazon, maybe 10,000 or more years ago, figured out of the tens of thousands of species of plant that exist there, that if you take the root of this and the leaves of this and you boil them together for 3 days, you get this brew that when ingested gives you access to levels of consciousness that you don't otherwise have, and enables healing of a kind that is impossible otherwise. And shamans are able to do these journeys with people, and you're lying in this place and somehow you're experiencing something in your psyches that is a shared experience. So it's pretty incredible. And so I was very open to that. And I had gone there to learn about healing. And I had all kinds of visions that night. And it was all about healing. One of them, which I'll share before I get to list, is I was shown a long line of people standing under the hot sun, and they're waiting to get a hug from a tiny woman at the end of the line. And I recognized her as Amma. She's known as the hugging saint. Amma means mother. The hugging saint from India. She's from the south of India. She travels all over the world. She comes to Boston every August. People stand in line for literally 12 hours, waiting to get a hug from her. And many of them then walk away in tears, having experienced a kind of unconditional love, perhaps for the first time in their life. And so the message I was given as I'm lying there on the banana leaves under the sky with the stars, and there was a lunar eclipse, and the 5 planets were lined up in the horizon. It's a magical setting. And I've got this voice in my ear as I'm seeing these visions unfold. And the voice says to me that all these people standing in line, they could be hugging each other. They don't need to wait hours to get a hug from that person. That we humans are the cause of suffering for each other. Most unnecessary suffering on this planet is caused by humans towards other humans and other life forms. We are the source of suffering for each other. We are also the source of healing for each other, as we were talking about earlier. You could hug the person next to you, and that would be every bit as healing, or can be as you go to that other person. Right? So we can all heal, help each other to heal together. And then the last vision of the night, I got these 4 words floating in my vision. And they came as an acronym. And I have this tendency to create acronyms for conscious for all the 4 pillars. I've got 4 acronyms, right? That capture the essence of that. So for leadership, it's selfless, right? And that stands for the qualities of a conscious leader, right? And etc. So this came as 4 words, and the acronym was the list. And the voice literally said, here's the list. Here is what we need in order to heal. Here's what business needs to heal in order to heal. Here's what people need in order to heal in the world. And the 4 words came into focus one by one, starting with love. And the message was very simple. Every single thing we do in life should come from love. Not fear, not greed, not anger, not jealousy, none of the other emotions. Even the hardest and harshest thing that you are called on to do should come from a place of love. Even if in a business you have to let somebody go, or you have to let somebody die in a hospital, whatever it might be, whatever the setting might be, and you have to do your duty in a way, that what is the right thing to do it with love. Everything, ask yourself, am I doing this with love? Right? It's a constant reminder that I have to make, because often, like all of us, you end up reacting to things and you do things out of fear, which is very common. In business, we do so much out of fear and greed. They are the primary drives, right? It seems, in business, not love. The second word was innocence. That we are all born innocent. The one quality we all share when we are born is innocence. The rest, the other qualities are different, right? I was born with that trusting and idealistic and whatever nature, and somebody else might be born with a different nature. But the one trait that is in common to all of us is innocence. And then what happens? We lose our innocence. We, in a way, get corrupted by the ways of the world, right? Most societies function, in a way that basically gets us to use our intelligence to take advantage of each other, climb over each other, win, right? We lie and cheat to get what we want, and all of that is normalized. And we are taught this is how you need to be. My father kept trying in that way, trying to corrupt me, because he said, no, you need to be, you can't hold on to those ideals, etc. And you don't have a choice as a child. You're born with that innocence, and then things happen to you, but you do have a choice when you're an adult. And you have a responsibility to choose wisely. Right? You can choose to continue being part of that system of corruption, or you can choose to live with a kind of innocence, which means not knowingly causing harm or suffering to another. My mother lived that way every day of her life. She was as innocent at 82 as she was when she was a little girl. She never veered from that path of innocence. So how can we choose the innocence, not the helpless innocence of a child, but the chosen innocence of a strong adult? And the third was simplicity, the love, innocence, simplicity. And the message was the most essential things in life are simple, and we overcomplicate. We are given this incredibly powerful mind. We use that to solve problems, but we also create a level of complexity. And sometimes we get lost in that complexity. We need to remember what the essential things in life are simple, right? And don't lose sight of those. And the last was the truth. What is our commitment to the truth in business, in politics, right? In the US, we have a lot of talk about what is true and facts and alternate facts and real facts. And, the truth is the truth. Yeah, sometimes there's subjectivity, or your truth and my truth. But overall, there is something called the truth in most situations that should be brought out. And the truth is more important and more fundamental than peace, because without truth, there can be no peace. That's why we have the truth and reconciliation, right? That's why Gandhi's autobiography was called My Experiments with Truth. Truth is so fundamental, and we have really lost sight with it. Right? So that phrase that came to me was sort of a gift that flowed through me, not just for me, I think for all of us. It's like love and truth, holding the innocence and the simplicity, right? And I think to me now, the rest of my life is really trying to live into that. How can I live with that love, innocence, simplicity, and truth in everything that I do? So it's really a twofold lesson. It's how can we all heal ourselves, acknowledge our wounds and traumas, and begin the path of healing. And I do believe psychedelics like ayahuasca and MDMA, which is having miraculous benefits for PTSD sufferers like veterans. I think that's part of it, but there's many other modalities like EMDR and many other things. Actually, a dozen or more new modalities are out there now. Heal ourselves and live by the list. To me, that's kind of the takeaway lesson for me. And one of the beautiful gifts also of this journey was healing my relationship with my son. Because you talked about cycles, breaking cycles, right? So yes, in a way, I was breaking a cycle by trying to heal my father wound and being so different from my father, right? And I had a chapter with that title in the book. And then one day I realized, oh my God, my son also has a father wound because he's special needs and he's so different from me. As I was different from my father, my son is different from me. And I came to see him. He was fine for the first few years, but then as his condition became more intense, I started to see him as kind of a burden, as kind of a responsibility, a heavy one at that. And that I can never expect the joys that you expect from a child getting married and having children and getting a job. That all of that was going to be denied to me. It was so focused on me. And that I just have to now take care of him for the rest of his life. And, I would spend the least amount of time I could with him and send him back to his group home and, just kind of do. And then I realized, oh my God, my father never accepted me for who I was. And I have not accepted my son. I've only seen him as his challenges, not him as a person. That was sort of an awakening. And then one day my partner Neha says to me, do you realize that your son is the list? He embodies love, innocence, simplicity, and truth. He's incredibly loving, more than just about anybody I've seen. He's very innocent, like a little child, even though he's 34 years old now. He keeps life very simple. If he has his music and his video games and a few other things that he loves, he's the happiest and most optimistic person in the house. And he cannot tell a lie. He's incapable of that. So here's somebody who's here to teach us, you know? And so it's completely altered my relationship with him. I now cherish him. I cherish my time with him. I don't see him as a burden. We have much more fun together. We laugh together. I take him on trips with me. So it's just one of the many, many gifts of this kind of an inner journey is getting that, as I said, the purpose, the inner peace, and the healing, all of those. And these are lifelong pursuits now. It doesn't end. You're never fully there. I have learned things since I finished the book that I wish I could have put into the book, but it's an ongoing journey.
Mm. Well, I'd love to maybe another discussion, another time, talk about the things that you learned after you wrote the book, because I've just been so enjoying this one. Is there anything that we haven't spoken about so far today that feels important to share?
No, I feel like we've touched upon all of these, all of the important things, the work side and finding my purpose there after being unhappy for so long there. But then the other parts of life were not in harmony. Right? I was happy at work, but not happy in my personal life. So ultimately, it's about full alignment, right? Who you are, what you say, what you do, what you value. Everything should be in harmony and in alignment, right? So you can't be one person at work and one person at home, and one kind of life here and different kind of life there. So I think, yeah, I think we've touched upon most of the key elements here.
Awesome.
And I do say in the book, I have added reflections at the end of every chapter,
Hmm.
uh, based upon what I've shared in that chapter, that how might it relate to the lived experience of the reader? And they might, people start telling me that they're finding those to be beneficial
Hmm.
to think through. Because, when I started writing this, I struggled a bit because I said, why should I write an autobiography? It wasn't meant originally to be a memoir. It's going to be a book about the 7 steps that I had learned about know yourself, love yourself, be yourself, choose your life, express yourself, become whole, and heal yourself. That was kind of the framing that had come to me in that silent retreat. But it ended up being something different, and I struggled with that. Is mine a story worth telling?
Hmm.
I'm not a celebrity and I'm not a big star or whatever it might be. But then I realized, the famous quote, I think, from Carl Rogers, that which is most personal is also most universal. That there are echoes of my story in many other people's experience. And people are able to connect surprisingly to a lot of these things in this book. So I think that is the hope for me, that this book gets people to think about things, reflect on them, and find some healing and a path forward in an easier way and earlier in their life than I had to wait until I was 50, 60 years
Hmm.
old
Hmm.
to get to some of those things. So that's really the hope in writing any book, I think, is to, everybody, as we say, all of us can learn from our own experience, but the brilliant thing is to try to learn from somebody else's experience. And if you can do that, that's a great bonus. And we have that available to us.
Hmm. That Carl Rogers quote has been in the back of my mind at various points in the conversation. So I'm glad that you
Mhm.
brought it in. And I'll say one of the reflection prompts, I forget exactly what the languaging of the question was, but it was something along the lines of, is there a challenging interaction that you've been putting off, or a challenging conversation that you've been putting off in your life? And there's many other examples I can give, but I have scheduled a conversation that I've been putting off for years now in the end of July. And so that's one very practical, tangible action that was inspired by your question. So just another plug for the reflection questions at the end of each chapter.
Wonderful. And the one other one that I want to make sure that I mention here, because it was so pivotal for me as well. In one of my planned journeys, I got this message that love that is not expressed is like a check that is never cashed.
Mhm.
It doesn't do any good for anybody. Right? You could have all the love in your heart for somebody, and you just take it for granted that, yeah, I think they know, and but they may not. And when you express it to them, it might be life altering, might become the most healing and joyful moment of their life. And this happened for me when I was with that coach. I worked for the first time, and I told her the trajectory of my life and my work and my relationship with my father and where I come from, and then how my life has changed since 2005, 2006, when I wrote Forms of Endearment, and all the work that has come since. And she was silent, and then for a while, and then she said, "Do you realize that you spent 45 years trying to impress your father? But now you spend the last 15 years honoring your mother with your work. And that's really been your purpose here, to bring your mother's energy." And then she says, "Does your mother know that?" I said, "Well, I didn't know that until a minute ago. How would she know that?" She said, "You need to call her and tell her that." I said, "Oh, we don't talk like that in my family. We talk about the weather and how your knee's doing, neutral subjects." He said, "No, it's important." I said, "Well, my father picks up every time I call. And he puts it on speaker. And if I say these things, he's going to say, 'What's wrong with him? Why is he talking like that?'" She said, "No, it's important." I said, "Well, I'm going to India in 3 weeks. I'll tell her in person. Why do I have to do it now?" She said, "No, your mother is 81. I don't know what happens." And so I called her the next day, and it turned into the most healing conversation of my life. Because I said, "Mommy, everything I've done that has made a difference in the world, that people have been impacted by, is because of you. What you showed us, and how you took care of us, and how you showed us what love really is." That's really what has made a difference. And I don't know if I would be here without you. She just started crying and she said, Raj, I am nothing. I'm nothing. I said, no, you're everything. Without you, I don't know if I would have survived this life. And so it became such a healing conversation for me and for her because she always thought of herself as insignificant. She didn't matter. She was only educated till the eighth grade. She didn't speak English. My father was this brilliant PhD, gold medal winning scientist, and so forth. And so she said, I'm just here to, cook and clean or whatever for this. And she realized then, yeah, she did make a huge impact. She's leaving a legacy behind. And so that I can't imagine if I had not been given that opportunity, how would have felt. She died a year later.
Mm.
And all that love would have been unexpressed and would not have given me the joy and her the peace near the end of her life. I have that recording on my iPhone, I can listen anytime. I miss my mother because both my parents died a year later. And the last thought I want to leave you with, when my parents died within 4 months of each other in 2019, sudden. I mean, they were both in good health and things happen and suddenly they're gone. My father first. And then I go to the funeral. I get there like a few hours after he died, and there's a whole rites, big funeral, lots of people. I look around, it's a very solemn occasion. Everybody's very sad, but there's no tears. Nobody's crying except my mother. The only sound you could hear of crying is my mother. My sister, me, nobody. And then 4 months later, my mother died, and nobody could stop crying. There were hundreds of people crying a week before she died, and while she died, and after she died, and the tears were overwhelming, overflowing with grief. And I said, what happens at the end of your life? Is it grief or relief? When some people die, there's a kind of relief. When my grandfather died, people were waiting for him to die so that they would not be under his oppressive, controlling, rule over their life. And people were waiting for years for him to die. So at the end of a momentous life, all you people feel is a kind of relief. And what does that say? So how can we live in a way that at the end of your life, there's grief and there's gratitude. Grief that you're gone, gratitude that you were here. That doesn't just happen. We have to start living that way. So that's kind of the last message from this book.
Mm. Well, Raj, this is a beautiful note to end on. I typically ask at the end of every interview what it means to you to live a meaningful life, and I am going to forgo because this was a perfect spot to end. And I'll also presence right now, every episode I raise awareness for an organization of the guest choice, and you've selected Pratham USA. Is that how you pronounce it?
Yes, yeah.
Pratham. So I'll make sure to link, of course. I'll make sure to link to that in the show notes. I'll link to all of your books, places that folks can connect with you, your talks, the numerous resources and folks who were mentioned throughout the conversation. I'll do my best to capture all of that in the show notes. This was the type of conversation that I think if anyone only tuned in for a random 5-minute soundbite, that they would get lots of downloads of insight, wisdom. And I was just deeply moved by the book. I was deeply moved by this conversation. And I'm so grateful that you reached out to me and let me know that you were releasing a new book and you wanted to be on my podcast. This was a really memorable one, and I'm just so appreciative and grateful for your time.
Oh, you're very welcome, Mike, and thank you for being such a wonderful listener and for reading the book and connecting with it at such a deep level. I really appreciate that.
Mm. So to all of you who are listening, I'm wishing you a beautiful rest of your day or evening. Take good care. Lots of love. If there's someone in your life that matters to you, let them know that you love them. And I hope to connect with you soon. Take care. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to listen to Mike's Search for Meaning. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe, share this episode with your friends, and leave a review. I look forward to seeing you next time, my friends. And until then, stay safe, stay well, and keep living with purpose. Peace.